It began, as so many neighborhood wars do, with a piece of paper slipped under the door. The slip was thin, plain, and almost laughably small in its demands, just $62. A fine, the letter explained in stern, bureaucratic language, issued by the Homeowners Association. It claimed a violation had occurred, a rule had been broken, and restitution was due immediately. At first glance, the letter seemed harmless, just another piece of neighborhood red tape, another invented offense conjured by the HOA board to justify their existence. Many residents paid these small fines without question, reasoning it wasn't worth the time, energy, or embarrassment to fight back. $62 was barely more than a dinner out or a tank of gas. But to the man who received it, the number wasn't what mattered. It was the principle. He hadn't broken any rules. The violation described was absurd, something about his trash bins being left visible for an extra day, though he had proof they'd been taken in on time. The HOA, as usual, hadn't cared to check. They fined first and expected compliance later. But this Tima, instead of quietly paying, he set the letter down on his kitchen table and stared at it with cold determination. He had tolerated the boss' petty demands long enough. He had seen them bully neighbors, inflate fees, and even drive families out of their homes with threats of foreclosure. They thrived on fear, wielding authority with smug self-importance. But for him, this was the final straw. It wasn't about $62. It was about being told to bow down when he had done nothing wrong. He decided then and there he would not pay. The days that followed revealed just how serious the board was about enforcing its rules. A second notice arrived, this one thicker, heavier, dripping with intimidation. It warned that failure to pay could result in additional penalties, late fees, and ultimately, legal action. It even threatened the possibility of a lien against his home. For $62, the absurdity of it all would have been laughable if not for the undertone of menace. The board wasn't really after the money. They wanted obedience. They wanted every homeowner to know that resistance was futile. If you disobeyed, they could take your house. They could strip away years of hard work and stability over the pettiest of grievances. Neighbors whispered about it when they saw him outside. Some urged him to just pay and move on. Others secretly admired his refusal, though none were brave enough to take the same stand. Everyone knew the HOA. President, an arrogant, controlling woman who relished her power over the community. She had made it clear in countless meetings. The board had the right to enforce rules by any means necessary. And so, the threats escalated. Another letter came, this one stating plainly that if the fine and accrued fees were not paid within 30 days, the board would move to seize his home. $62 had ballooned with penalties into over $200. Soon, it would grow larger still. The HOA was manufacturing debt out of thin air, twisting the system to trap him. But rather than scare him, it fueled his resolve. If they wanted a fight, they would get one. He began gathering documents, organizing proof, and studying the HOAS bylaws. What he discovered was both infuriating and empowering. The board was riddled with inconsistencies, overstepping its own authority. Time and time again, they counted on homeowners being too weary or too intimidated to push back. He wouldn't be. At night, he sat at his desk, writing down everything he'd learned. Every letter was cataloged, every photo of his property, every time-stamped video proving compliance, every record of past violations issued unjustly. It was all compiled into a growing file. If they came after his home, he would be ready to strike back with undeniable evidence. The HOA board, however, wasn't slowing down. They scheduled a formal hearing, demanding his presence, where they intended to vote on authorizing the lien. It was a show of power, designed to humiliate him in front of his neighbors and force him to submit. They expected him to crack, to apologize, to pay. But, as the date drew near, something unexpected began to happen. Whispers of his resistance spread through the community. Other homeowners, long resentful of the board's heavy hand, started reaching out. Quiet conversations at mailboxes and nods of approval on sidewalks hinted at a growing undercurrent. People were tired of being pushed around. It was no longer just about $62. It was about years of bullying, years of unreasonable fines, years of fear. The HOA board had made one critical mistake. They had chosen the wrong homeowner to target. And now, instead of cowing him into submission, they had awakened something they couldn't control. The night before the hearing, he sat alone in his living room, looking at the pile of documents neatly stacked on the coffee table. He thought about the countless families who had folded under the board's pressure. He thought about the smug smiles of the HOA leaders as they counted on another easy victory. He thought about how small the fine was, how easy it would have been to pay it and be done. But, deep down, he knew, paying would only feed the beast. If they could threaten to seize a man's home over $62, what couldn't they do? What wouldn't they do? This wasn't about a fine anymore. It was about freedom, dignity, and the right to stand on one's own land without being bullied. The papers were ready. His case was solid. The community was watching. Tomorrow, the board would discover that their biggest mistake wasn't the fine, or the threats, or even the hearing. Their mistake was underestimating the resolve of the very homeowner they thought they could crush. Because tomorrow, the fight would begin. The morning of the hearing arrived with an uneasy stillness. The neighborhood streets were quiet, though beneath the calm surface, tension simmered. Word had spread that the HOA board intended to make an example out of one homeowner who had refused to comply with their demands. For many, it was another routine display of authority. For others, it was a spectacle worth watching. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. At the front sat the board, 5 members perched behind a long table draped with a navy cloth. At the center was the president, a woman who had ruled the association with an iron fist for years. Her posture was rigid, her expression sharp, her voice ready to slice through any objection. Around her sat the other members, each complicit in the system. Some were true believers, intoxicated by the power their positions granted them. Others simply feared the president too much to speak out. Together, they had become a machine of control, operating with cold efficiency. When the homeowner entered, carrying a neat folder of documents under his arm, every eye turned to watch. Some neighbors nodded quietly in support. Others avoided his gaze, fearful of being associated with defiance. And at the back of the room, a few curious onlookers leaned forward in their seats, eager to see what would unfold. The president wasted no time. She launched into a speech filled with rehearsed authority, reciting rules and citing sections of the HOA bylaw. She spoke of violations and non-compliance, her tone dripping with condescension. She framed him as reckless, irresponsible, and a danger to the orderly harmony of the community. And then, with an almost triumphant smile, she announced the board's intent: if the fine and accrued fees were not paid immediately, the HOA would authorize a lien against his home. For most homeowners, this would have been the breaking point. The thought of losing a house over a few $100s would be enough to force compliance. That was the board's weapon: fear. Fear of financial ruin, fear of legal entanglements, fear of being cast out. But what the board had not anticipated was that this homeowner had come prepared. When his turn to speak arrived, he stood with calm steadiness. Without raising his voice, he began to lay out his case. He produced photographs, time-stamped and showing his trash bins neatly placed away on the very day he had supposedly violated the rule. He held up letters that documented similar false violations issued to neighbors. He read aloud passages from the bylaws themselves, pointing out inconsistencies, overreach, and outright abuses of power by the board. One by one, the faces of the board members shifted, some flushed with irritation, others stiffened with discomfort. The president attempted to interrupt, dismissing his evidence as irrelevant, but the crowd in the room stirred. Murmurs of agreement spread from row to row. For the first time, the board's control over the narrative began to fracture. What was supposed to be a one-sided display of dominance had turned into something different. It was no longer about $62. It was about accountability. It was about whether the board's authority had limits. Neighbors began to whisper louder now, emboldened by what they were hearing. Some shook their heads in disbelief at the pettiness of the violation. Others exchanged glances that said what they dared not voice aloud: if they can do this to him, they can do it to me. The president, sensing her grip slipping, doubled down. She raised her voice, declaring that the board had absolute authority, that rules were rules, and that anyone who challenged them threatened the integrity of the community. Her words were sharp, but they landed poorly. The more she insisted on her power, the more the crowd bristled. The homeowner didn't need to raise his voice. His calm, steady recitation of facts was more powerful than any outburst. By the time he finished, the mood in the room had shifted entirely. What began as an attempt to shame him had instead exposed the board's arrogance. The board called a vote, as procedure demanded. Predictably, the president and her loyalists voted to proceed with the lien, but two members hesitated, their hands hovered, their eyes darting nervously to the restless crowd behind them. In the end, though fear of the president's wrath won out, the motion passed. The room erupted in mixed reactions. Some gasped in outrage. Others muttered angrily. A few slipped out in silence, shaking their heads. The homeowner, however, did not flinch. He gathered his papers calmly, nodded once, and walked out. The board thought they had won. They believed they had delivered their message loud and clear. Resistance was futile, but what they failed to see was the seed that had been planted in that room. Neighbors who once bowed quietly now walked home with new questions burning in their minds. Was the HOA truly serving the community, or serving itself? And for the homeowner, the battle had only just begun. The lien was not the end. It was the beginning of a larger fight, one that would stretch beyond fines and bylaws and into the very heart of who held power in the neighborhood. That night, as the board congratulated themselves on another show of force, the homeowner sat at his desk once again. He opened his laptop, began typing, and prepared to take the fight to the next level. The HOA had made their move. Now, it was his turn. The lien notice arrived 2 days later, printed on thick paper and stamped with official language meant to intimidate. It declared the homeowner delinquent, his property subject to legal claim by the HOA. It was the kind of letter designed to send shivers down a person's spine. For years, it had worked flawlessly. Most who received one would rush to the board's office, checkbook in hand, desperate to make the problem disappear. But this time, the strategy backfired. Instead of folding under the pressure, the homeowner scanned the letter, filed it neatly into his growing collection of evidence, and began his The first step was exposure. He knew the board thrived in silence, issuing threats in private, counting on homeowners' fear to keep their abuses hidden. So he decided to drag everything into the light. He began by drafting a detailed letter of his own, one that told the full story from the false violation to the hearing. It included photos, timestamps, and excerpts from the bylaws that contradicted the board's claims. He printed copies and slipped them into mailboxes across the neighborhood. By the next morning, whispers turned into conversations. Neighbors who had long suspected corruption now had proof in their hands. Some were outraged to see just how petty the board's actions had been. Others saw their own experiences reflected in his account. The inexplicable fines, the dismissive attitudes, the intimidation. The homeowner's letter gave them something they hadn't felt in years. The HOA president reacted exactly as expected. Furious at being challenged, she sent out a counter letter to the community, dismissing the accusations as lies and painting the homeowner as a troublemaker bent on undermining neighborhood harmony. But the tone was defensive, and the cracks were starting to show. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now began sharing their own stories. A man at the end of the cul-de-sac confessed he'd been fined for planting flowers of the wrong color. A single mother revealed she'd been charged hundreds for a fence repair that wasn't her responsibility. A retired couple quietly admitted they'd paid thousands in penalties over the years, too afraid to challenge them. The president had always counted on fear to keep the community divided and silent, but the homeowner's defiance had created something dangerous: solidarity. Meanwhile, the homeowner dug deeper. He attended county records meetings, researched property law, and discovered just how fragile the HOA's authority truly was. Many of their threats were bluffs, built on the assumption that no one would ever question them. Their bylaws were outdated, riddled with contradictions, and in some cases, flat out uninformed. Armed with this knowledge, he began preparing a legal response, not just to fight his lien, but to challenge the very foundation of the board's power. The board, sensing their control slipping, escalated their attacks. They began sending daily notices, tacking warning signs to his front door, even hiring a security officer to patrol past his property at odd hours. It was a performance, designed to make him look like a problem resident. But the performance was back. Other neighbors saw the harassment and shook their heads. They had lived under the president's reign long enough to recognize her tactics. Betty Stein. Instead of silently watching, some began to reach out. They slipped notes into his mailbox offering support. They called late at night, sharing their own experiences and pledging to stand with him. The neighborhood was changing. Fear was no longer the board's weapon, it was becoming their weakness. One evening, as the sun dipped low and streetlights flickered on, the homeowner sat at his desk, reviewing his growing binder of evidence. Each page told a story of abuse, each record a testament to years of unchecked power. But now, he wasn't fighting alone. He could feel the momentum shifting. At the same time, the president sat in her immaculate home, fuming. For years, she had ruled unchallenged. She had crushed dissent with ease, silenced complaints with threats, and built an image of unshakable authority. But this one, refusal to pay $62 was unraveling everything. In her mind, the battle wasn't about money either. It was about control. If she allowed defiance to go unanswered, the whole system would collapse. She told herself she would not let that happen. She would escalate further. She would make an example so severe that no one would dare resist again. But in her determination, she overlooked one critical fact. The neighborhood was no longer on her side. The fight that had started with a single fine was spreading, transforming into something much larger. The homeowner had struck a nerve, and the board's authority was crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. And as the board prepared its next move, the homeowner prepared his. The battle lines were drawn, and both sides believed they could not afford to lose. The stage was set for the conflict to erupt beyond letters, fines, and meetings. The quiet suburban streets were about to become the backdrop for a war over power, control, and the right to call a house a home. The board's retaliation was swift and merciless. Within days, the homeowner found his property under siege. Notices were taped to his door every morning, each one accusing him of new violations: grass half an inch too tall, a small crack in his driveway, even unapproved holiday decorations, though it wasn't even the holiday season. Each notice came with a fine, each fine stacked on top of the lien already hanging over his home. It was a barrage designed to wear him down. Most people would have caved under the sheer volume of harassment, but instead of breaking him, it fueled his resolve. Every notice was photographed, catalogued, and filed into his growing binder of evidence. Every petty accusation became another piece of ammunition. The board escalated further. They sent letters threatening to suspend his community, revoking his right to use the pool, the clubhouse, and even the parking lot. They went so far as to suggest that he was creating a hostile environment for his neighbors, an accusation as vague as it was laughable. But again, they underestimated him. Because while the board was trying to bury him under paper, he was preparing his counterstrike. The homeowner had been quietly meeting with an attorney, one who specialized in HOA disputes. Together, they combed through the bylaws, county statutes, and case law. What they uncovered was damning. The board had been overstepping its authority for years, issuing fines without proper hearings, enforcing rules that weren't legally valid, and threatening homeowners with liens they had no right to impose. Armed with this information, the homeowner filed a formal complaint in county court. Not only did he challenge the lien against his property, but he accused the HOA of harassment, abuse of power, and violation of due process. The filing was public, and once word spread, neighbors began to take notice. Copies of the complaint circulated quietly from mailbox to mailbox. Residents who had felt powerless for years suddenly saw hope. Someone was standing up, someone was fighting back. And he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for all of them. The board, however, doubled down. The president, furious at being dragged into court, called an emergency meeting. She framed the lawsuit as an attack on the community itself, accusing the homeowner of wasting everyone's time and money. But Tista, in her words, didn't land the way she intended. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some even spoke up, timidly questioning whether the board's obsession with punishing one man was truly in the best interest of the neighborhood. It was a turning point. For the first time, dissent had been spoken aloud in a board meeting. The homeowner, meanwhile, wasn't just relying on the courts, he took his story online. He created a simple website where he posted every document, every notice, every letter he had received. He uploaded photos and recordings of the harassment, and he laid out the facts for anyone to see. The site spread like wildfire through the community, and soon even people outside the neighborhood were paying attention. The president's carefully cultivated image of control was crumbling. Still, she wasn't ready to give up. She authorized the board to hire an expensive law firm to defend against the lawsuit, using HOA funds paid by the very residents who were growing increasingly resentful. She believed sheer force of money and intimidation would crush her opponent. But what she didn't realize was that the more she spent, the more the community turned against her. Whispers grew louder. Homeowners began asking where their fees were really going. They started comparing stories of their own fines, their own harassment, and slowly they began to rally. Some offered to testify in court. Others wrote statements detailing years of abuse. The tide was shifting, and the president couldn't stop it. The homeowner knew the battle would not be easy. Court cases moved slowly, and the board's tactics were relentless. But every step of the way, he felt the balance of power changing. What began as one man refusing to pay $62 was now a full-scale rebellion against the HOA's tyranny. Late one night, as he sat at his desk flipping through his binder, he realized something profound. He was no longer fighting just to save his home. He was fighting to save the entire community from the grip of a corrupt board. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, but so was the support gathering around him. The board's retaliation had been meant to break him. Instead, it had exposed them. And now, the war that had started quietly on one street was about to spill into the courtroom, where the HOA would be forced to face the consequences of their arrogance. The lines were drawn, the sides were chosen, and the neighborhood was no longer the same. The weeks that followed the courtroom showdown were unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. Where once the streets had been quiet and polite, filled with carefully manicured lawns and forced smiles, they now buzzed with open conversations, late-night gatherings, and whispers of change. The ruling against the board had shaken the community to its core, and the residents, once silenced by fear, were beginning to realize just how much power they truly held. But the HOA president wasn't ready to surrender. She returned from the courthouse with fire in her eyes, determined to reassert control. She called emergency meetings, issued new letters filled with legal jargon, and attempted to rally the board around her. She insisted that the court ruling was only a temporary setback, that the homeowners' victory was exaggerated, and that the association needed her strong leadership more than ever. Yet, the harder she pushed, the weaker her grip became. Neighbors who had once nodded silently at her commands now questioned her openly. At meetings, residents demanded financial records, asking where their fees had gone and why so much had been spent on lawyers. When she tried to deflect, murmurs rose, voices hardened, and the mask of authority she had worn so confidently began to crack. The homeowner, for his part, didn't gloat. He didn't strut through the neighborhood bragging about his victory. Instead, he worked quietly, encouraging his neighbors to take action. He shared resources about HOA reform, explained the process of calling for a recall vote, and urged residents to focus on building a fair, transparent system instead of replacing one tyrant with another. His calm leadership stood in stark contrast to the president's frantic attempts to cling to power. Soon, petitions circulated. Signatures gathered. More and more homeowners voiced their support for removing the board and electing new representatives who would actually serve the community. The movement grew too large to ignore. The president tried to discredit the effort, calling it a witch hunt, but no one was listening anymore. The night of the recall meeting arrived with palpable tension. The clubhouse, once a sterile chamber of intimidation, was packed wall to wall with residents. The air was thick with anticipation. For years, the board had ruled without question. Tonight, that era would end. The president tried one last time to sway the crowd. She stood at the front of the room, her voice sharp and commanding, warning of chaos and ruin if she were removed. She spoke of rules, order, and tradition, but her words no longer carried the weight they once did. They sounded desperate, hollow, even absurd in the face of everything the community had endured. And then came the vote. Ballots were passed, hands scribbled quickly, and when the final count was announced, the result was undeniable. The president and her loyalists were out. The board, once feared, had collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. The room erupted not with cheers of victory, but with a deep, collective exhale. The spell was broken, the neighborhood was free. In the days that followed, new leaders were chosen. Regular homeowners, people who cared about their neighbors rather than power, stepped forward to take on the responsibility of rebuilding trust. Transparency became the new standard. Budgets were opened for all to see. Rules were simplified and enforced fairly, and for the first time in years, the community felt like a community again. As for the homeowner, he returned to his life with quiet satisfaction. His house was safe, his dignity intact, but more importantly, his neighbors were no longer afraid. He had never asked to be a leader, never sought to become a symbol of resistance. All he had done was refuse to pay $62 he didn't owe. But that small act of defiance had ignited a revolution. The former president, meanwhile, faded into silence. Stripped of her power, she became just another resident. Her once feared presence now little more than a cautionary tale. People crossed paths with her at the mailbox or on the sidewalk, but no one bowed their heads anymore. She was no longer the ruler of the neighborhood, just another face in the crowd. And so, the story came full circle. What began with a petty fine ended with the liberation of an entire community. The battle had been fierce, the costs high, and the wounds deep, but in the end, the lesson was clear. Power built on fear will always crumble when people find the courage to stand together. On a quiet evening, the homeowner sat on his porch, watching children ride their bikes down the street and neighbors chatting freely by the sidewalks. The air felt lighter, freer, as though the weight that had pressed down on the neighborhood for years had finally lifted. He sipped his coffee, leaned back, and allowed himself a small smile. The HOA had threatened to seize his home over $62, but in trying to take it from him, they had lost everything. And he, without meaning to, had helped give his community something priceless in return. Freedom? The day of the court hearing dawned gray and heavy, as though the sky itself mirrored the weight of the conflict that had consumed the neighborhood. For weeks, tension had built on every street corner, behind every closed door, and around every kitchen table. The battle that began with $62 had grown into a storm no one could ignore. Inside the courthouse, the air was electric. Neighbors filled the gallery, their murmurs echoing off the tall ceilings. Some came out of curiosity, others out of quiet solidarity. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen an HOA president challenged in such a public way. The board members arrived together, dressed in stiff suits, their faces set in cold determination. At their center was the president herself, her chin lifted high, as if daring anyone to question her authority. And then came the homeowner, calm and steady, binder of evidence tucked under his arm. He didn't need theatrics. He had facts, truth, and, most importantly, he had the quiet but growing support of a community that had been silenced for too long. The case began with the HOA's attorney, who painted the homeowner as reckless, combative, and disruptive to the peaceful order of the neighborhood. They recited a litany of supposed violations, each one more trivial than the last trash bins. Grass length, decorations, driveway cracks. To the board, it wasn't about the specifics. It was about showing the court that rules had been broken and that the board's authority was absolute. But then, it was the homeowner's turn. He stood slowly, opened his binder, and began to present his case. Piece by piece, he dismantled the board's narrative. Photographs showed his trash bins stored properly. Time-stamped videos proved his compliance. Documents revealed inconsistencies in the fines. And when he read aloud from the bylaws themselves, it became painfully clear. The HOA had been acting outside its authority for years. The courtroom was silent, except for his steady voice. Neighbors leaned forward in their seats, captivated not by drama, but by the sheer precision with which he exposed the truth. Even the judge's expression shifted from neutrality to growing concern as the evidence piled up. And then came the turning point. Witness's neighbors, who had quietly endured the board's tyranny for years, began to step forward. One after another, they testified to their own experiences. Fines for flowers, threats over fences, liens over minor disputes. Their voices shook at first, but with each story told, confidence grew. What had once been whispers in driveways and hushed conversations at mailboxes was now spoken openly, under oath, for all to hear. The HOA president sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of fury barely contained. This was not how it was supposed to go. She had expected the homeowner to be humiliated, crushed by the weight of the board's authority. Instead, it was her own power that was unraveling in real time. By the end of the day, the narrative had flipped entirely. What began as a case about a $62 fine had become an indictment of the board itself. Their arrogance, their abuse of power, their disregard for due process, all of it laid bare under the unforgiving lights of the courtroom. When the judge finally spoke, the words echoed like a hammer striking steel. The lien against the homeowner's property was invalidated. The fines were dismissed, and more importantly, the court ordered a formal review of the HOAs practices, citing concerns over abuse of authority. The room erupted not with cheers, but with a powerful wave of murmurs, sighs, and knowing glances. The residents had seen what happened when one person stood up. They had seen the board humbled, and they would never see their neighborhood the same way again. The homeowner left the courthouse not with a triumphant smile, but with quiet resolve. The victory was sweet, but it was not the end. The board would not give up easily. They still held their positions, still had access to HOA funds, still had influence. But now, the illusion of invincibility was gone. Back in her immaculate home, the president seethed. For years, she had ruled unchecked. Now, her authority was questioned, her leadership weakened, her name whispered with resentment instead of fear. She told herself she would not let it end like this. She would fight back, harder than ever, no matter the cost. But in her desperation, she failed to see the truth. The community had changed. The people who once bowed their heads now held them higher. They had found their voice. And as the neighborhood simmered with talk of reforms, recalls, and new leadership, the battle that began with a single piece of paper was about to reach its final, decisive chapter.